Well, many of you have contacted me and indicated you like the Hollywood type cases. And today's case, I guess you'd call it a Hollywood type case. It involves a record producer, Phil Spector. He was quite a personality as well as a celebrity. And we learned something in the celebrity case of O.J. Simpson is we've got to have all of our ducks in order. So we didn't file charges against Phil Spector at the beginning. We wanted to dot the I's and cross the T's and double check every piece of evidence, make sure that everything was ready if we were to go to trial. So I was involved in, from the very beginning, the Phil Spector case, saw all the different phases of it, all the planning and the preparation. Well, who was Phil Spector? Well, he got his start at Fairfax High School. A group of his friends put together a group called the Teddy Bears. And they did a few recordings, and they were successful. And then he hooked up with the Crystals, and then the Ronettes, Be My Baby. They made a lot of hits, a lot of hits. And then he went on to work with the Righteous Brothers, all the hits with the Righteous Brothers. Then with Tina Turner. Then eventually, with the Beatles, he did Let It Be, Let It Be. Well, what was so unique about Phil Spector's music? It's called the wall of sound. And what he had learned to do was to layer sound as far as instruments as well as vocal, and you blend them together and you make such a beautiful sound that everybody loves. So he got well known for that. Well, he went on to make a lot of money off recordings over the years. Now we're going to be talking about him as a personality as well as the trial of his case. And I think you're going to find it pretty fascinating. So let's get into what are the facts of the Phil Spector case. Well, what is our topic today? Actress killed in castle. Death of actress Lana Clarkson, or the Phil Spector case? Well, what are the facts of this case? Well, it all begins that Phil Spector, back on February the 2nd, 2003, wanted to go out to dinner with someone, and he decided to contact his old high school girlfriend and called her up and said, "Hey, why don't we get together for dinner? I'll come by and pick you up." And she said, "Fine." So it was arranged that he would come by and take her out to dinner. So he got his limo, that was his limo there, and he got his chauffeur to drive for him that night. And they go out to San Fernando Valley and pick up his old girlfriend. And they drive over to the Grill in Beverly Hills. Very, very fine restaurant. Grill on the Alley, it's called. Wonderful food, good drinks, and a pleasant place. And while there, Phil is talking to his old girlfriend from high school. They're reminiscing about the good old days. And he notices a waitress there. And the waitress is attractive. She's young. And she's talkative to him. She notices that. So after they've had dinner, he decides to have his girlfriend, his old girlfriend from high school, taken home in the limo. And then they drive back to the Grill and pick up that waitress. And the waitress gets in the limo with Phil Spector, and they go over to Trader Vic's in Beverly Hills, and they have some drinks. And they're Navy grog. Not just one, he had 6 Navy grog, which are very strong drinks. So they sat there, talked for maybe an hour or so at Trader Vic's, and then they got back in the limo. They drove over to Dantana's, which is in the West Hollywood area on the Sunset Strip, and there it goes in, a very congenial crowd there, and has several more drinks. So Phil Spector was feeling no pain, and he was happy to be there with the attractive young waitress from the Grill who was sitting there with him. And then it's getting late, maybe getting close to 1:30, and he decides to go back in the limo and drive down to House of Blues, not too far away. And there was still a pretty good crowd there at the House of Blues. Goes in there and he has a Bacardi Straight, and he's wandering around with his waitress friend there, and then he decides to go up to the VIP room, which is upstairs, and he goes up there, and he goes up to the hostess there and says to her that he wants to go in, and she says, "What's your name?" And then she said to Phil Spector, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Spector, your name is not on the list." That infuriated Phil Spector, and he demanded the manager come out, and the manager came out there and saw what was going on and said to the hostess, "No, of course Phil Spector can come in." And he reprimanded her. Now, her name, that hostess, was Lana Clarkson, and she apologized to Mr. Spector for not letting him in there. So she immediately got some drinks, free drinks, gave him more drinks with his waitress friend. So they went back to a special section of the VIP lounge, and she's trying to be as cordial as she can. And all of a sudden, Phil Spector notices that this hostess, Lana Clarkson, is quite attractive, very tall, over 6 feet tall, very good looking, and he compared it to the waitress from the grill. And he realized he would be much better off with this hostess. So he has the chauffeur take the waitress from the grill back to the grill, gets rid of her, and then the limo driver comes back to the House of Blues and waits for him. And they have a few more drinks there, and he's trying to impress this hostess. Her name is Lana Clarkson, and who was she? Well, she was the star of Barry and Queen. There was 2 episodes of that, and she was in both of them. And she did very well at that. However, after a while, she kind of was having difficulty getting new parts, and went to a lot of comic conferences where she would sell posters of herself. She would autograph them. So that was one of the ways she made money. So that was what Lana Clarkson was doing at the time. And why was she there at the House of Blues? Because she was trying to meet people as well as get back into the entertainment business, because she had broken her wrists and she was not able to be acting for almost a year. So at the very end, Phil Spector is starting to leave, and Lana Clarkson's also leaving, and they walk out together, and he says to her, hey, why don't you come over with me, come over to my place for a drink, just one drink, come over. And she kept saying no, and he says, no, come on here, my limo is right here. And eventually she says, okay, just one drink. Well, wasn't a very good decision on her part, and she gets into the limo with Phil Spector, and she thought it was just a close by place, but it wasn't. They drive for a number of miles to Alhambra and to his castle, and this is his castle in Alhambra, which is maybe 5 miles east of downtown Los Angeles. And what he did was, as soon as he pulled in the gates, he stops, tells the limo driver to stop, so that he could get Lana Clarkson out. And he always wanted to impress the ladies by making him walk up all these stairs to his castle. And then when you get to the top there, you see this castle. This was pretty impressive. Now, this most likely is about 2:30 in the morning. And they're walking up these stairs, and when you get to the top, this is the grand entrance. It looks like a medieval castle when you walk inside. There's armored knights there, and walked on into the living room area. And he tells her to sit down there, and they would have a drink or two, and maybe he would play the piano. And so there was an hour or two, maybe several hours, that they're socializing right there at on the sofa, and you can see there's some drinks there, a candle is lit. So this went on for a while, but at one point there was not exactly what you'd call a meeting of the minds, and what Spector had on mind was totally different from what Lana Clarkson. He had sex on his mind, and he didn't want her to leave. You know, here he had a very attractive, tall, gorgeous woman in his castle, and he didn't want her to leave at all. But on the other hand, she had been working all day, and here the barbarian queen was tired. She wanted to go home. She'd had enough. So she's there to leave. She's trying to leave. But the problem is where is she? You know, she doesn't know where she is. She doesn't know the address. She doesn't have a phone with her. What is she going to do? So she gets her purse, and she goes over to the foyer area, and she sits down in the chair there, hoping that, you know, somehow the limo that brought her over there would be made available so it would take her home. So she's sitting in that chair in the foyer, and what Phil Spector does, he opens this drawer. He takes out of this drawer a revolver, and this is the revolver he takes out, and he sticks it in her mouth, right there. He sticks the gun in her mouth, and bang! There's a shot. The question is, who pulled the trigger? Did he pull the trigger, or did she pull the trigger? She is shot through the mouth, hits her spinal cord, kills her instantly. She's dead right there in the foyer of the castle. So what's going to happen now? We know that the chauffeur is outside, in the chauffeur at the back door. He's most likely within about 15 feet of where she is shot. Now she's inside, and that's the back door there, but he hears the shot, and the chauffeur gets out, and he walks around. He's wondering, where's this noise coming from, and he can't figure it out. So eventually he's standing there, and then all of a sudden Spector opens the door right there. Spector is standing there. He's got a bloody gun in his hand. He's standing right there at the back door, within just a few feet, and Spector says to the chauffeur, "I think I killed somebody." Wow, what is the chauffeur going to do? Hard to know what to do in this situation. So he looks through the back door. He looks inside, and he can see the lady that he brought over there with Phil Spector. She's in this chair. Her body is slumped, and there's blood on her face. Wow, what a sight. So he doesn't know exactly what to do, and he doesn't know the address. So he gets back in the limo, and he drives down to the entrance gate, and there is the address listed at the front gate, and he gets on his phone. First he calls the secretary, Phil Spector's secretary, and isn't able to get through to her, but then he calls the police, and he tells them what happened, and he doesn't know what to do. Well, the police come out to Phil Spector's castle, and when they get there, they can see him upstairs walking back and forth, and they tell him to come out, and he won't come out, and eventually, they shout at him, and Several minutes later, he comes to the door and he starts to be combative, and they shoot a taser at him, trying to calm him down. Eventually, they're able to take him into custody. He's taken down to the police station, and he's interviewed by one of the detectives there, and he makes a number of various statements to the detective. First he says, I can explain what went on, I can explain everything to you. And then the next he says, the gun went off accidentally. It was just an accident. It was a mistake, just a mistake. And then he made this statement. A little later on he says, I don't know why that bitch shot herself in my house. Why in my house? So these were all kind of inconsistent statements as he's rambling on. Well, eventually the detectives are called in to go to the house to see what evidence they can find there. And, well, go in there and they find there's a number of items on the floor. And they pick them up, they seize as much evidence as they can, but they notice that Lana Clarkson is slumped in this chair, and she has her purse over her shoulder as though she's ready to go, leave someplace. And they check around the house and they see that there's blood on the doorknob and also at the door jamb there. They can see blood, as well as blood over on the handrail for going upstairs. Why? Why all this blood in various places? And when they check out the bedroom upstairs, they see that there's a jacket right there. And that jacket has little pieces like a mist of blood, dots all over this white jacket that Phil Spector was wearing that evening. All right, so continue to look through room after room. They find in the bathroom, right downstairs next to the foyer, there is a rag. Looks like a diaper rag full of blood, very bloody. And they check it out, and what's going on? What is it used for? Why? And they noticed that Lana Clarkson's face had been wiped. The blood on her face had been wiped around her mouth area. And then when they looked by her legs, and there's the gun. There is a gun right in that position there. You can see next to her leg on the left side. Now she's right-handed. Okay, so what does all this mean? And when they eventually picked up the gun, they noticed that the gun had been wiped. There you can see there's white marks showing somebody somehow took a rag or something and wiped the gun. Well, Phil Spector is arrested. He posts bail and is released, and no charges are filed. And why? Why? Well, there was a reason for that. Not too far before, the O.J. Simpson case was had, and it didn't go very well for the district attorney's office. And it was decided this time, whenever there's going to be a celebrity publicity case, they want to check all the evidence out ahead of time. In the O.J. Simpson case, they had to file the charges quickly, and they were not able to analyze all the blood for DNA and so forth. So this time, it was decided that everything was going to be checked, double-checked, and triple-checked before any decision would be made as to whether charges would be filed. So that went on for a long period of time, and while this is going on, Bob Shapiro was hired by Phil Spector to represent him, and he came forth with all sorts of information about Lana Clarkson, that she was depressed. She committed suicide in Phil Spector's house because she wasn't able to get jobs. She was getting older. She had broken wrists. and she was taking these drugs for pain, and she went off them too soon. And they went through all of her emails, and they found that she had some kind of depressing messages there because she wasn't able to get jobs. So experts were called in, and they supported that Lana Clarkson was depressed, and she committed suicide at Phil Spector's house. Well, the DA's office had to make a decision on the case, whether they were going to file charges or not. Many meetings were held, and a lot of discussion went into it as to if they would file and what charges would be filed. And this was a presentation that was put together, and this was something that I had prepared for Pat Dixon, who gave the presentation to the district attorney. And when I prepared it, I wanted the decision to be made as to what crime to file, whether to file second-degree murder or involuntary manslaughter. It was an important decision as to how to file this case if we were to file it. So there was a tremendous amount of discussion at the meeting. And at the very end of it, when Pat Dixon finished the presentation, he turned to Steve Cooley, and Steve Cooley turned and said, "Okay, if you think you have enough evidence, let's go for it." And those were the deciding words, and as a result of that, charges were filed against Phil Spector for second-degree murder, and the trial began. It took a long time to get started, but eventually and at the beginning, the judge was Judge Fiddler. And he made this decision with a lot of pressure from the news media to have gavel-to-gavel coverage of the Phil Spector trial. And this was, not a good thing for the prosecutors, but you had to go along with what the judge ruled. So now there's going to be TV cameras in the courtroom, like in the O.J. Simpson case, from the beginning to the very end. And every morning, Phil Spector arrived at the courthouse with an entourage of linebackers from the NFL football team. These huge gentlemen would escort a short little Phil Spector to the courtroom. It was quite a spectacle every morning, this little parade of bodyguards. Well, just before the trial began, Phil Spector would go back to Dan Tana's Sunset Strip, and one evening when he was there, now he's out on bail during the, pending on the trial, and he meets this Rachel Short there. And she was an aspiring model, singer, and they, developed a talking friendship between them. Now, she's only 24 years old, and, she was working at Jerry's Deli. That was her job, but she wanted to be discovered. And they started dating, and after that, she wanted to get married, and they got married. And where would be a better place to have the wedding? In 2006, they had the wedding right there in Phil Spector's castle, right there in the foyer where Lana Clarkson was killed. Wow. Interesting place for a wedding, and there it was. They were husband and wife, and when the trial was going on, she was at his side every single day, coming to court with him, sitting there watching the trial. Now, as to the prosecutors in the case, as I had indicated, Pat Dixon was the lead prosecutor for the district attorney's office, and Alan Jackson assisted him and really did a lot of the presentations of certain witnesses, and a decision had to be made as to whether to use Phil Spector's statements. And the statements were of him saying that the gun went off accidentally. It was a big mistake. And the prosecution decided if we introduce those, even though they're slightly incriminating because they're inconsistent, but it gives Phil Spector an opportunity never to testify and to get in front of the jury this accident, a big mistake. So it was decided not to present the evidence of Phil Spector's statements that he made to the detective right after the shooting. So the idea was to force Phil Spector to have to take the witness stand, and we'll have to see whether that strategy worked out. Now, as far as Phil Spector, he decided that if you hire the top attorneys, you can beat the case. And Bob Shapiro, as we know, was in the O.J. Simpson case. And O.J. walked. He was acquitted. And Leslie Abramson, she came in. She had represented one of the Menendez brothers, very famous attorney. And then he brought in Bruce Cutler, who represented John Gotti, and got John Gotti off, the mobster. So here he was getting the top attorneys who had gotten people off. So I guess, that was going to be useful for him. And if that wasn't enough, he had more attorneys. He had a parade of the top attorneys from all over. Wow. You couldn't have had a better group of attorneys representing you in court. Now, when it came to the opening statement, that was done by Alan Jackson, and he had a PowerPoint presentation that he gave to kind of educate the jurors as to what the facts of the case was going to be about. And it went on for about, 45 minutes, where he laid it out, and the jurors paid attention, and they were making notes. They were very interested in how he was describing what happened at the castle between Lana Clarkson and Phil Spector. Now, the defense, on the other hand, they were trying to create a reasonable doubt. And at the opening statement, they had Bruce Cutler, the mobster attorney, and he came in and he attacked the investigation. And his theme was, police had murder on their mind, meaning they weren't trying to look for evidence. They had made up their mind. They were going to convict Phil Spector without considering the evidence. So he did that for the opening statement for about an hour. And then Linda Kenny Bodden, she came in and she presented it more in a scientific, methodical manner. And she was trying to show that the evidence proves that Lana Clarkson shot herself. For whatever reason, she took that gun and shot herself in the mouth. Well, anyway, when the evidence was being put on by the DA's office, it was like pieces of a puzzle coming together, and they all fit together, and they proved that Phil Spector pulled the trigger, and he was guilty of second-degree murder. So that was the evidence pattern, and one of the key things was that Phil Spector many times had invited women over to his place, his castle, and if they didn't go along with sexual favors for him, he would pull a gun on them. He would pull a gun on them and threaten them with the gun. So the DA's office had these various women come in and testify to prove bad acts and show modus operandi. And this is what they did. There were at least 5 women who came in and said that he had done exactly the same thing to them, but they weren't shot at. He didn't pull the trigger, but he threatened them with a gun. So that was very powerful evidence that was presented. Next, the chauffeur came in and testified to all the events that happened that evening, as far as picking up the high school girlfriend, driving her over to the grill, going to Trader Vic's, Dantana's, and then going over to House of Blues, driving Lana Clarkson and Phil Spector over to the castle, and then hearing the shot and looking in and hearing Phil Spector say, "I think I killed somebody." So he talked about the facts, and he also talked about, he called the 911 operator, and on that one he said, "I think my boss shot somebody." So his evidence was very crucial because it kind of gave a timeline as to what happened. Now the defense had to attack the testimony of the chauffeur, and on cross-examination they were trying to show that, well, he was saying all of this to make Phil Spector look bad because he wanted to curry favor with the prosecutor, to have them support him so he could stay in the country, because he was from Brazil, and then they say, well, he didn't understand English, so he really couldn't understand what Phil Spector was saying, and they were trying to say that he didn't have a good memory. And then they talk about he couldn't hear. He was outside and there was a fountain, a water fountain next to the back door there, and it was making so much noise. There's no way he could have heard what Phil Spector was saying. And then they came up with all sorts of reasons why the jury should not believe the chauffeur and his testimony. Now, the prosecution brought in the coroner, and the coroner gave a lot of testimony about Lana Clarkson's wrists, how there were bruises on her wrists, and talked about her mouth. The gun had been in her mouth, and the trigger had been pulled, and the coroner said, hey, it wasn't suicide. It had none of the ingredients of suicide, and that was very powerful testimony from the coroner. Then from the crime lab, they had information about DNA, and they found that Spector's saliva was on the victim's left breast, and the victim's DNA found on Spector's groin area. So what was going on between the two of them? And we do know in his pocket was a pack of Viagra, and 2 of the pills were taken out of the 3-pack. Well, what does all this add up to? Well, was there some type of foreplay going on and he wanted more as far as sex, intercourse, or was there intercourse of some type? Or was there a frustration by a person who was drunk, who wanted to have sex? Well, that was the DNA evidence, but one of the most powerful pieces of evidence was the blood spatter. And in that, the first part of that is, we have this expert, Lynn Harrell, and she testifies that the gun had been wiped, as well as the victim's face had been wiped. That wasn't natural. Somebody did it. Now, remember, Lana Clarkson died instantly. She isn't going to be able to wipe her face or wipe a gun. And as to the jacket that Phil Spector was wearing, it had these little pieces of, like a mist of blood spots on there. And in Dr. Harrell's opinion, he would have had to have been within 2 to 3 feet of Lana Clarkson when that gun went off, even though Phil Spector, they're trying to make it look like he was yards and yards away. He wasn't anywhere near where she was when the trigger was pulled. So that was the evidence that was presented, and when the defense, they attacked Dr. Harrell's testimony, and they said, oh no, that Spatter can go 72 inches, and she exhaled, and they had all sorts of theories how that blood spatter got on Phil Spector's white jacket. And they even, some said that it was maybe prime rib that was splashed, and that's what it was. So the defense had all these theories about the jacket. And they tried to bring in all sorts of experts, defense experts, to testify that Lana Clarkson had committed suicide. They tried to bring in Dr. Henry Lee, and that didn't work out real well because there were witnesses who saw that Henry Lee had picked up some evidence at Phil Spector's house after the killing and had not shared it with the prosecution. And he lied about having that evidence. So they couldn't put him on the witness stand because the judge says, look, Dr. Lee, you're not telling the truth. You picked something up and you're not revealing it now. So he was not, the defense wasn't going to call him as a witness because he had been impeached by his actions. And they tried another doctor, and he didn't work out either. So the defense was narrowed down. They had to call these other doctors, experts. And how convincing were they? Well, that was kind of questionable. Now, the case went on for months and months, and the idea was to force Phil Spector to testify. So he'd take the witness stand, and of course the prosecution would be able to cross-examine him. But he didn't take the witness stand. He refused to take the witness stand. What the prosecution was hoping for, but it didn't happen. So the jury never heard those statements that Spector had made about it was a mistake, it was an accident. Oh, I don't know why the bitch, shot herself in my house. None of those statements were heard by the jury. Now, they were going to have a field trip going out to the castle, and I knew that was going to be difficult because in the O.J. Simpson case they had done it, and it had backfired on the prosecution because they had changed everything in the house, O.J. Simpson's house. So when the jury went in there and looked around, it was totally different. And I was, we were certain that we weren't going to allow that to happen this time. So what I had prepared was, when the jury went through, I had posters of what it looked like at the time of the shooting. So when the jurors walked through, they could see, oh, that's what it looked, that's right. And that prevented the attorneys, Spector's attorneys, from making any changes. So the prosecution thought, well, okay, we'd covered all bases. They weren't going to be able to pull anything over on the prosecution. But we were wrong. We were outsmarted. What they did, and we didn't know that until a little later on, there's the fountain by the back door, and they're trying to claim that the fountain made so much noise that the chauffeur could not have heard Phil Spector saying, I think I killed somebody. And what happened was they had turned up the water, and so the fountain would make a lot of noise when the jurors were out there. So when the jurors walked by, it was noisy from the fountain. The prosecution never knew that somebody from the defense team had turned the fountain up so it would be very noisy. Argument. Alan Jackson had a presentation that he gave showing all the evidence that had been presented to the jury and what it all meant. And it was very impressive, laying it all out so they could see what had been presented by the prosecution and what the defense had tried to do to create a reasonable doubt. Now, the defense argument was kind of interesting. As I said, Bruce Cutler was brought by Phil Spector from New York, the mobster attorney who had gotten John Gotti off. He came out here. He was there for the beginning of the trial, and he was there for about 2/3 of the trial. And then he got interested during the trial in being a TV star. And he lost interest in the Phil Spector case, even though he was supposed to be the lead attorney on it, and he started not showing up for the testimony of various witnesses, and he kind of disappeared. And eventually he withdrew from the Phil Spector case before the argument. So it fell upon Linda Kenny Bodden to do the argument. And here we have her testifying about all the scientific evidence, and she said, prosecution, all they did, the law enforcement, they just collected the usual suspects. They brought the usual suspects in. They didn't look for the evidence. And, they're trying to convict, Phil Spector because he has, funny looking hair. It was kind of a strange argument that she made, but she spent a lot of time, hours, going over all the scientific experts that had come in and testified. Now, on rebuttal, Alan Jackson got up and he went through every piece of evidence. There was 10 separate arguments that the defense had made, and he showed that they had not proved one of them. It was all speculation on their part, but no evidence had been presented to prove any of that. Very powerful rebuttal. Now, the jury went out. The case, took 5.5 months. They deliberated for 12 days, and it was a hung jury. It was a mistrial, and the final vote, it was 10 for guilty, 2 for not guilty. 2 people had a reasonable doubt that Phil Spector was guilty. Well, there was a second trial, and this time Judge Fiddler, maybe he had seen the error of his ways, and he decided, no, it wasn't going to be gavel-to-gavel coverage. No longer would there be cameras in the courtroom except at the opening statement and an argument, but not when the witnesses were testifying. Well, this was highly beneficial to the prosecution because when witnesses came in, they felt, more willing to testify when the cameras aren't on them. So that was a positive sign, and the attorneys, the prosecution, Truck Joe was brought in to help Alan Jackson for the prosecution. And this time, for some reason, Phil Spector, only had one attorney, Storen Weinberg from San Francisco. He came down and he tried the case for Phil Spector. And they had a different approach. This time they called a different expert. And the expert came in and was trying to say, that there was evidence that on Lana Clarkson's fingernails, it was her fingernails, had blood spatter. And he showed these photographs to the jury. But the prosecution was able to prove that those were not Lana Clarkson's fingernails. This was from a prior experiment that he had done. So it was misleading to the jury. And so the argument this time around was a little bit different. Truck Joe, the new prosecutor, said that Spector was the demonic maniac. And her argument was the defense theories continue to change, constantly changing like shifting sand. And close with this, and it was kind of, hit the jury. She said, this is checkbook defense. If you can't change the facts, change the evidence. If you can't change the evidence, change the science. If you can't change the science, buy the scientists. The defense had paid over $419,000 to have defense experts to come in and tell their stories. Well, what happened? Well, the defense did their, and for some reason, the defense attorney tried kind of the same approach that was done in the first, and he had all these 14 points, that they were going to prove. Every one of them was laid out, and it was almost the same as had been done in the first trial. And this time, Alan Jackson got up on rebuttal and went through every single one of those 14 points and showed to the jury that none of them, not one of them, had been proven by any evidence. It was just mere speculation. Well, these words were at the very closing of Alan Jackson's argument. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what would you tell Lana at the House of Blues when she's walking out in the back door of the House of Blues? Don't go. Don't go." And I think that had an impact on the jury. They listened to that. And even though the first trial was a hung jury, the second was a guilty of second-degree murder. There were more women on the second jury. Did that have an impact? Well, we don't know. But that was the outcome. And when it came to sentencing, the sentence was 19 years in state prison. Wow. It took 6 years for justice to be done in this case, but it was finally done. Well, if you want more details on the Phil Spector case, get my book, Actress Killed in Castle. It lays out everything about the investigation and about the trial, the first trial, and even the second trial. So if you want more information, read my book. It's all in there. Well, hopefully you enjoyed this episode, and maybe you found something new about Phil Spector and his music. What a genius he was in creating music that we listen to today. What a tragedy for Lana Clarkson, a young lady, a beautiful young lady, very talented, vivacious, had quite a future ahead of her. But also it was a tragedy for Phil Spector. Now he could have, pled guilty, undoubtedly, to involuntary manslaughter, and most likely would have served a couple of years in prison. But he would have been out. He would have been able to enjoy his life. How sad for him, Lana Clarkson, and everyone else involved in this case. Well, hopefully you will join us again for another True Crime Files podcast when we take another case and we examine it from beginning to end. See you then.